you'll see in your answer on page 49, at lines 19 to 21, you say which data sources, but you don't say all of them. You just reference some data sources that Itron looked at. Yes, you might.
The witness has asked. Yeah.
I remember the nature of your question, but not the particular.
Okay. Did Itron explain why it picked the particular sources that it used as a basis for making its EV growth projections as compared to some other, for lack of a better term, I'll call more optimistic projections?
Okay. I don't know.
Did you yourself try to figure out what, sort of along the lines of Mr. Marin's question here, what the sensitivity was of the Itron projections? In other words, if you looked at the most optimistic view of what electric vehicles introduction might be versus what Itron put at high level, what, if any, difference would that have made in how GMP made its judgments?
Our team has done that type of thinking and looking with respect to the magnitude of sales that EVs and some other end uses could provide, as you say. In the context of longer-term strategic planning, I'm rusty on those conclusions, though. I don't have a lot of insight as to that choice of the forecast that's in here, the ER14.
Well, and I realize we're looking here at a very short rate period. Can we expect that that kind of information will be available in part of the multi-year rate plan?
I expect that we will be looking at that increasingly over time in long-term resource planning like IRP, multi-year forecast updates as well. As you probably have in mind that the transition that the auto industry seems to be undergoing with pretty widespread investment in electric vehicles and technology. So yeah, I do expect we'll be revisiting this quite a bit. I'm just not that current on what we recently did.
I think that's all I have for you. I don't know others have here. No?
Mr. Chairman, just to follow up on your line of questioning, we'd be happy to address that more in the multi-year plan context. Certainly understand the questions and happy to address those.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. Including sort of how Itron, assuming you're still relying on Itron at that point, how Itron is making its choices. You know, are they optimists or pessimists?
Sure. Thank you.
Mr. Burke, any follow-up from anything we have?
I have one quick question, Mr. Smith. You referred to the sensitivity analysis you did earlier this week with respect to the INS charge. Did you provide that to anybody at the department?
No, that was we pulled out the model yesterday or the day before and basically changed some cells in the spreadsheet. And no, that
one follow-up, one line of follow-up. Mr. Smith, you asked some questions about the MPV model, and in particular, what changes in the out years in the model might do to the overall profitability of the program. When you're looking at an NPV model, can you just explain in terms of the relative value of benefits earlier versus later in the model, how you look at that?
Well, in short, the value of costs and benefits in an NPV analysis is larger in the early years. The weight depends on the discount rate that's used, but my point that I may have perhaps inartfully was trying to make was just that the weight in a present worth assessment, benefits and costs of changes in the benefits stream, like the capacity prices or R&S we were discussing, is going to be limited in its weight. GMP's discounting in many analyses uses a nominal discount rate that is consistent with our weighted cost of capital. Think a number on the order of 6 or 7%. You get 5 or 6 years out, that the weighting of $1 or change in the forecast that far out is many tens of percent less than one if it happened, say, in the first or second year of the program.
Okay. And so when you were speaking about the fact that, for example, capacity prices are really locked in the first few years of the model, and I think you'd offered us a number of capacity prices would need to change by more than 30% to have a really significant impact. Is that taking into account the fact that those prices are really locked in the early years?
You summarized my point correctly. It is different a little bit from the present worth one, and the short story is no. When I stated that to make the program in our analysis break even by essentially lowering capacity prices, to answer the question, how low would they have to go to make a present worth break even, I said around a third. That was a lifetime number. Flat reduction through all years. For that to happen, if the first several years of capacity prices I mentioned and the value of a megawatt saved, if that's largely locked in, as we believe it is, through the clearing of the next several capacity auctions, because they're done 3 years ahead, to get a reduction of about a third, in my example, that would mean that the capacity market prices for the years that have not yet been auctioned would have to decline more, like 40 or 45%. I did not, however, to the essence of your question, I don't know that exact number, but to get to a third lifetime, it would have to be probably 40% or more of a drop throughout, consistently through the period, compared to our forecast after year 3.
Great, thank you. That's all I have. I believe Mr. Fisk is next. It sounds like the department may no longer have questions for Mr. Fisk, but we have just a couple of minor corrections to make to his testimony while he's here.
Let's hear it. All right, that's fine.
Good afternoon, Mr. Fisk. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Can you please state your name and your position with GMP for the record?
My name is John Fisk. I am the leader of engineering at Greenbelt College.
Great, thank you. And you've submitted direct and rebuttal pre-file testimony in this case, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any corrections to make to that testimony?
I have 2 corrections.
Can Can you just walk us through those two corrections? It sounds like there's one in the direct testimony, is that correct?
That's correct. On page 11 of 25, there's a table, row 4, and in the category called transmission lines, column entitled interim period, there's a number in the exhibit that is 8009. That really is 8091. All of the numbers in the table have references.
Thank you. And then you had a correction similarly to a table in your rebuttal pre-filed, is that correct?
That is correct. On page 27 of 32, row 5, we have again a table, and we have column headings of 2018, 2019, and then for the rows, the annual T blanket totals. Under the column heading 2018, the number in that row for annual T blanket should be 37,392,427.
And any other corrections there?
Yes, one more correction. Under column heading 2019, the number should be 32,949,727.
Okay, thank you. Any other corrections to make?
That's all the corrections we have.
Okay. The testimony is already in evidence, but move to amend it as described.
Mr. Brooke? Smith? Okay. Accept.
The witness is available if there are any questions from the commission or otherwise.
Mr. President, I understand that just yesterday the department changed its recommendation with respect to several of the motorized air brake switches. But my understanding is that there are still two switches that are in dispute. Is that correct?
Yes, there's two that are in dispute.
So I guess I'll just ask questions about those two. Is the company replacing those two switches, those two manual switches, because the manual switches are at the end of their useful life?
No, that's not the main driver for replacing those switches. The switches are being replaced so that we can have remote control of the switches using their SCADA system, supervisor control data acquisition system.
So, I guess the issue that I think the commission has to decide here is those existing manual switches is equipment that customers already paid for, and they still have some value because they're still have useful life left over, and the GMP is just taking those out and putting in new switches that aren't, at least as I understand it, necessary at this point from an operational standpoint. Is that correct? I mean, you could still operate your system with the manual switches, correct?
Yes, we can still operate those switches. The reason for the switch replacement is so that we can provide better reliability to our customer and reduce the duration of an outage. We can provide a more safe mechanism to repair the line. We can remotely segment the line that has faulted in, say, a really bad storm. We can then get the other customer back in service. We can then schedule in a controlled time to have the crews go and repair that line. We don't need to rush out and repair it in order to get power restored to the customers.
So I understand that the company obviously wants to provide the best service that it can. What's the analysis, though, that the company does to decide when it's worth it to put in a new piece of equipment? I mean, how much outage time is going to be avoided by installing these two switches?
So the amount of outage time will vary. It depends on several factors. So it's hard to really do a fixed analysis of how much time you're going to save because the outages will vary. Crews may be in different locations, the availability are in the transmission system. So when we have a fault on this line, the substation, the customers are out that are affecting the substation, so it could be the whole town, the whole area, out.
And have the substations that are served by these switches that are being replaced, the two that are in dispute, have they had faults in the recent past?
I don't know that exactly. My assumption or my educated opinion would be, yes, they have, but I can't tell you when. I can't tell you how many off the top of my head.
So, how does the company respond to the department's sort of overall critique that, the company could spend an unlimited amount of money and almost attain perfect service, but obviously that's not economically rational or feasible. How does the commission draw the line as to when it's a useful investment in the system to replace a switch like this, and when is it? What I guess we're getting at is whether these will really be useful upgrades. How should the commission approach making those decisions?
Yeah. So in my opinion, these switches are extremely useful. And I don't believe that one data point in terms of frequency is really the right method to determine if a switch is used or not. We have approximately 145 types of switches in use throughout our system. And we have been programming trying to get these types of switches installed because we do see benefits to these switches as an operational tool. So when GMP determined which switches to select, it was discussions with our folks that operate the system, and they're the first-hand people that know where they will benefit from having a manually or having a remotely motor operated switch.
For context, how many manual switches are there left on your system? Is it a significant number, or is this a small number of switches that remain to be upgraded?
I don't have an exact number of how many manual switches we have left. I wouldn't term it as a small number, but I wouldn't term it as a significant number. Some places will. It sounds great, but I don't think it's like twice as many left to go, but I don't think it's 5 or 6 either.
Is it your goal to eventually have all motorized switches as opposed to manual?
In a perfect world, that'd be wonderful, because we try to modernize the grid, and having remote capability to switches will obviously allow us to do that. But I don't see us doing that for every switch, because not every switch is going to be able to provide the same value in terms of customers that we see.
I have
No, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Do you want to take the break, or do you have a little 4-minute witness here?
I would stay within my 5 minutes for Mr. Shields. I just have one question.
Mr. Shields, it's only 5 minutes.
All right.
We could finish him. It's not 4 minutes, but 5 minutes is pretty good.
Okay, all right.
Mr. Shields.
Then you can have lunch without worrying about the cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Mr. Shields. Great to know you. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth and whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Shields. How are you?
Thank you.
Can you state your name and position with GMP?
Yes, I'm Kirk Shields. I'm Director of Development and Risk Management.
Great. And you've prepared direct and rebuttal testimony in this case, is that correct?
Yes.
And do you have any changes to make to that testimony?
No.
is available.
Just a couple quick questions about the JV solar storage projects.
Good.
And at GMP, you're responsible for overseeing the construction of those projects, correct?
Yes.
And all three of the projects that are in this rate case are currently the subject of CPG proceedings that are ongoing before the commission.
That's right.
And to the best of your knowledge, have there been any known delays in scheduling in any of these three projects?
No, all three are well on their way to stay on schedule.
That's all.
You were supposed to take 5 minutes.
You heard your instruction for 4. Anybody up here? Mr. Smith? Can you redirect? Okay, thank you. Do we want to put Ms. Carlson on? I don't think there's much cross for her either. So.
Okay,
No problem.
I have no questions on the
okay.
Well,
Mr. Smith, are you able to stick to your estimate, or?
I can tell you that I can do it in less time. I have no questions.
I don't think we have any questions either, so unless the other staff or the commissioners have any questions for Ms. Carlson.
We'll miss you, Ms. Carlson. All right, well,
excellent.
well, we're on a roll here. You want to offer another one?
I know.
That might be the right place.
I think we're done with the GMP.
Okay, good. 5 after 1, 25 after 1?
Great. Thank you very much.
Good.
Talk about that.
Okay, 1:30.
I'm gonna lock this guy back in his corner here.
It's good. Starved me.
Are we going to have your witnesses go if you're
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I mean, they're going to stay for
anyway? And yeah, so we would go, you'd be the first one.
Josh, you need Josh?
However, second.
Unspelling the Green Company.
R-H-E-E-M.
RHEEM.
Okay.
Did you get the car minutes? I guess I should. Yeah, why don't we at least consider doing it right after?
Yeah, that's fine.
I was just thinking about it.
I don't know if I
Yeah, no, I've been flipping through them. I have a lot of things to do with. How do I feel about transmission? How do I feel about the constitutions I do? Fair play. But I didn't think actually.
So you guys
I'm always.
there is right at this hotel, right next to us, over there, a restaurant in the base.
Oh, great.
So we are going to have the GDS witnesses, not the GDS, but the GM. I was going to direct you guys to a place where you can go get sandwiches. Presuming you didn't pack.
There's a restaurant right at the hotel next door. I don't know how quickly they are.
Sometimes they're quick, sometimes they're not. There's,
Capitol building's great.
Yeah.
The food there.
Yeah, there's a cafeteria actually in the State
That's
House
where I'm
building,
going.
which should be open now. There's also Montpelier, it's very small.
Okay.
What
So-
you can see from here is pretty much the downtown
Right
area.
down the street, there's Subway, there's a couple other.
There's a sandwich shop called Pinky's. So if you go out in front of the building and go right,
Mhm.
about 2 blocks down, you'll get into like the downtown area. There's Pinky's is a local sandwich shop that does pretty well. If you like Thai food, they have a really good Thai takeout place called
Not eating
Lines.
Thai.
But it's spicy.
Don't get me wrong, I like Thai
It is
food.
spicy though. They do not.
I like Thai food.
There's also a place called the Skinny Pancake that does crepes. That's pretty good. And do like savory
Like
crepes.
cafeteria might just be easy. We get whatever. That seems reasonable. Huh?
And if you want to get something, even bring something back. That's fine. I have a packed
Okay.
lunch, and you guys can just send me an email or something.
Right.
I'll let you know.
Okay, that'd be great.
Do they know how to get to the
Our
restaurant?
I can,
bags
yeah,
off in your
I'll get
office.
down to
or-
my office. Send me the address and stuff like that. I'll go over some stuff with you.
private back door to my office.
The same.
And, is it now the department?
We have the global foundry.
Oh, okay.
So, you have no questions, right?
I have no questions for global foundry. And I have no questions at this point either.
All right, does anybody up here have questions?
Mr. Flatter.
No? Is that it?
Our case for us.
Nice job.
So if that's the case, the department will call on Mr. Chris Dawson.
That's a good trick.
And, just for the record, so we're clear, is there a Rev representative here? Are you intending to participate in the hearing?
No, I'm just listening today.
And your name for the record?
Olivia Campbell Anderson, Renewable Energy Vermont. Thank you.
Thank you.
Because I'm a legal party and I have no idea. You see they called me.
Yeah, this morning.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dawson. Do you have with you copies of your testimony and exhibits that were pre-filed in this case?
I do.
And is there a need to make any revisions to any of the testimony or exhibits?
No need to make any decisions.
The testimony and exhibits have already been included, and the department makes Mr. Dawson available for cross-examination.
Okay. Mr. Smith, are you doing any cross with this witness?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Hicks. Good afternoon, Mr. Dawson. How are you?
Good afternoon. Doing well. Had an excellent lunch.
Good, good. We met earlier today, but my name is Jeff Han. I'm counsel for Green Mountain Power. I have a few questions about your testimony. First, I just want to start with background. You are employed by GDS Associates? Okay. And that firm's based in Atlanta, Georgia?
Yes, sir. Headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. We have offices in 6 different states.
Okay. Welcome to Vermont. We turned down the temperature and turned on the snow just for you. This is the first time you've worked on a matter in Vermont, is that correct?
Yes, sir. That is correct.
Okay. And prior to filing your testimony in this proceeding, you didn't meet or speak with anyone at GMP regarding the concerns you expressed in your testimony, did you?
I would say I did not speak directly with any representatives from GMP. I did have continued correspondence with the department and their ongoing discussions with GMP over the past several months, at least with, as it related to items of my testimony.
Okay, great. I want to ask you about a few of those. First, in your testimony on page 2 of your SIR rebuttal, I don't think you need to turn there, I'm just going to summarize. You have 4 recommendations in your SIR rebuttal with respect to GMP's procurement process. Is that correct?
That sounds correct, yes, sir.
And my understanding is, with respect to the status of those recommendations, Mr. McNamara provided testimony on behalf of the department explaining that GMP and the department have reached a tentative agreement on how to approach those procurement process questions. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, yes, sir.
Okay. And that tentative agreement resolves the concerns you've expressed in your testimony. You're deferring to Mr. McNamara on those issues, correct?
Yes, that is correct. I understand that GMP, maybe in particular Mr. Smith and Mr. McNamara and others have had conversations, and it seems like they are on the right path, maybe just talking about a few things that can be helpful.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. Now I want to turn to your testimony on the Tesla Powerwall program. First, just for context, we asked you some discovery about this. I think you acknowledged that you're not an expert on battery degradation, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. But one of the concerns you express is whether or not GMP has appropriately modeled degradation in its analysis of the program. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Were you here this morning for Mr. Castingay's testimony?
I was.
And I understand that in your testimony you expressed the opinion that you don't believe GMP considered degradation in the way they modeled the Powerwall. Is that correct?
I would say in my testimony, or concerns with GMP's modeling of degradation. And I'd also add that listening to the testimony this morning did at least help enlighten me a little bit more about how GMP is accounting for degradation and their perspective with the way they have set up the analysis.
Okay. So when you filed your direct testimony, we've had a fair amount of discovery in this case. I recall you asked a number of questions actually specifically about GMP's hourly dispatch model. Do you recall those questions?
I honestly do not recall, but I specifically those questions.
Okay.
But I do remember when we were looking at a few things, and this may have been in line somewhat with the procurement, the risk management procurement, we were asking about capabilities of our department.
Okay. You don't recall asking us to produce the detailed hourly data from the hourly dispatch model as part of discovery?
I do not recall that.
Okay. If I showed you a response in which you requested that, would that refresh your recollection?
That would probably help.
Do you have any reason to dispute that you asked for that?
I will agree with you that I probably did ask for it, yes.
Okay. More importantly, I guess I want to ask, did you have an opportunity to review that hourly dispatch modeling data as part of your analysis here?
Dispatch hourly modeling data, are we referring to the Powerwall
Yes.
program?
Yes.
I did look at some data, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Before Mr. Castingay's testimony today, did you understand that that hourly dispatch model actually did incorporate a 3% annual degradation factor?
No, I did not understand that, and I'll elaborate just a little bit while we're talking about this degradation factor. You know, in GMP's analysis, and I believe in some of the testimony prepared by GMP on the battery feasibility and the Powerwall program, you know, they laid out a couple of things trying to explain how they're calculating benefits and, you know, compared to the cost of the program. And one of the things they looked at is, okay, how can we shave and reduce our capacity peaks? How can we shave the transmission peaks? How effective will that be? And they were using a couple of different factors. I call it like a 3-factor combination when they were looking at capacity, transmission, energy benefits.
And do you recall what those were? They were physical effectiveness?
Physical factor, maybe a communications, and then maybe a forecasting.
Okay.
And I don't recall having any concerns with the communication and the forecasting. What got my attention, and the reason I was asking about degradation specifically, was because on the physical factor, it seemed to indicate that, for example, for capacity, that the batteries were 100% available for every peak shaving opportunity. And my concern was, well, if there is some physical battery degradation over time, then that means the 13.5 hours that are available day one, year one, is not going to be available, at least not in that capacity over time. So that if I'm dispatching a battery, just one battery, for example, at 5 kilowatts, and I've got 13.5 hours to utilize it, I believe that rough math is something like 2.7 hours. And my only point was, well, over time, we all understand that the batteries will degrade. We may argue about just how much.
Okay.
But over time, maybe that 2.7 hours at 5 kilowatts becomes 2 hours at 5 kilowatts, or it could be 3 hours at 4 kilowatts. And it wasn't clear to me how GMP was taking that into account.
Okay. But now that you've heard Mr. Castigay's testimony, you understand that they did actually use, I think you referred to hourly dispatch modeling in the procurement context as a sophisticated approach to analyzing these kinds of things, correct?
That's correct.
And the exhibit you prepared here, CCD2, was a more simplistic look of if you assume degradation occurs in the following way, here's what might happen, correct?
That is correct, yes.
It is not based on the kind of sophisticated hourly dispatch modeling that GMP and Tesla did, correct?
That is correct. And so thinking about that, I haven't had a lot of time to review exactly what Tesla did. I understand that they have put in an immense amount of effort, especially since they are providing some type of financial guarantee about how these things are going to perform, in trying to understand how they could effectively shade these capacity transmission peaks, which I believe, and maybe in line with GMP, that's where the vast majority of the benefits are going to occur. And the, I guess the specific thing that I'm trying to understand is, how much experience does Tesla have in understanding? Like, it's one thing to go back and look historically and go, oh, well, we understand the peak occurred at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon for the month of August, and we could have dispatched batteries there, and these are the types of predicators we're going to be using to understand when we get to those peaks.
Mr. Dawson, I appreciate that perspective. I just want to understand. I think you said you didn't had a chance to consider that model further, but we did provide the model in discovery. There was a lot of discovery about the model.
Right.
If you had confusion about how degradation is actually taken into account, you could have reached out to GMP or Tesla to better understand that, correct?
Right, which is why we had discovery questions that continued down that line. Yes, sir. No,
but you didn't ask for.
It wasn't. Sorry, Jeff.
Yeah.
It wasn't clear to me that GMP was using degradation and accounting for that, and I'm still not sure how they were accounting for that because of that physical effectiveness factor. That's where I'm still confused. Just
Okay. Okay. Great. With respect to the 3% factor that's used, did you hear Mr. Castingay's testimony this morning about the assumptions that Tesla makes with respect to establishing that 3% degradation factor?
I can't say that I'm specific.
Do you agree generally that the number of times a battery cycles is related to the degradation that will occur?
I do agree, yes.
Okay. And we asked you in discovery, you didn't have any independent basis to know what that 3% was calculated on.
Right.
Okay. And you didn't, when you filed your testimony, know if that was a conservative or more conservative or less conservative factor based on how GMP will actually be using the model.
That's correct.
Excuse me, the battery. With respect to the duration of peaks, do you agree with Mr. Castingay that even if the peaks get longer, that the batteries may not be needed at full power over that entire period of time? Is that a reasonable potential outcome?
Meaning that the physical capability of the batteries in there, it can still be extended. In other words, it may not be able to hit 5 kilowatts per unit, but it may be able to provide 4 kilowatts over the extent.
I guess I'm asking more specifically, within any individual peak, you may not need the full power over that full time. So 1 hour may be higher, but less, and you may need less the next part of the hour.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I would agree with that. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to ask you also briefly about your opinion as it relates to capacity and RNS charges. Do you agree with Mr. Smith that the capacity and RNS are really the primary drivers of the Powerwall benefits in the model?
I do agree with that, yes.
Okay. And do you agree that that model doesn't consider some other potential revenue streams that GMP could pursue in the future with the batteries?
It's my understanding from what GMP has done, or at least presented, is that they are expecting the primary benefits of being capacity and transmission peak shaving. Are you asking me, are there other potential applications where there could be benefits?
Yeah, for example, the regulation market. Did GMP include any potential benefits from the battery associated with the regulation market?
I don't believe they included any regulation or other ancillary benefits.
Okay. So that is a market they could eventually use the batteries in, you agree?
Yes and no. Obviously, batteries are very sophisticated creatures, and part of the chemistry that goes into designing a battery, a lot of the battery storage developers will ask what are you going to use this battery for? Are you using it for regulation, frequency response, ancillary services? Or are you using it for capacity, transmission, peak shaving? And obviously, you know, the depth of the discharge, the number of discharge, number of cycles, all of that comes into play. So, you know, maybe they could use it, but then maybe you're also exceeding your expected degradation of physical capacity.
Okay. So there are opportunities to look at use cases and maximize the benefit of the batteries, correct?
I agree. I certainly think there are opportunities, yes.
Okay. Do you agree that, irrespective of the Powerwall program, that GMP, on behalf of its customers, has significant annual obligations to pay capacity and RNS charges?
Well, ask that
Yeah,
question.
do you agree that GMP, just regardless of the battery program, they have significant annual obligations for capacity and RNS charges?
Yes, yes.
And as part of meeting their obligations to customers, they have an incentive to stay on top of the forecast for those attributes, correct?
Yes.
And do you understand, Mr. Smith has testified that in looking at this particular program, the Powerwall program, they really use the same methodology that they use for evaluating other capacity and RNS opportunities?
Meaning kind of the same criteria, the same
Yep.
metrics. That's what Mr. Smith was testifying to?
Yes.
I'll take you at your word.
Do you agree that he's testified that they, for example, they rely on the same regional consultants to inform their opinion about forecasts of capacity and RNS?
I'll agree with that, yes.
Okay. And I'm correct, am I not, that GDS, neither you or GDS has any experience forecasting capacity or RNS prices in the ISO New England market, correct?
That is correct.
And you haven't prepared any analysis on the future expected market prices for capacity or RNS in New England, is that correct?
I have not been asked to, that's correct.
Okay. And as part of this case, you're not offering a counter forecast to say, here's what I actually think capacity and RNS prices are going to be compared to GMP's model, correct?
That's exactly correct. I'm glad you asked that question. So here's my concern. I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but I'm pretty sure that GMP witnesses have already said that they agree it's very tricky business, forecasting capacity and transmission rates. We sit here today, we try to do the best job we can, and that establishes typically a base case, and we try to compare alternatives. You know, what would be a good alternative if this base case type of situation, or type of projection would occur. Part of my testimony was dedicated to, I have some concerns about the original capacity and transmission projections because of X, Y, and Z. But more importantly, I want to understand, how does this Powerwall application compare to other potential demand response programs, other alternatives? And what happens when I sit here and assume that maybe the world isn't going to turn out the way I anticipated? I am wrong a lot. I make a living on being wrong. I've been sitting here 11 years ago and said, hey, look, gas prices are going out the roof. I've been really wrong. And right, and for the extent that somebody makes a lot of decisions based on that one set of circumstances, it can be a terrible outcome. I'm a big fan of diversity. I'm also a big fan of looking at potential alternative outcomes, because we all understand in this business that things are going to change. And because of that, we want to make sure that whatever you're doing, whatever road you're going down, whether it be GMP's Powerwall program, somebody building a new nuclear facility, you know, whatever dream they have, you want to make sure that it looks good and that you have some contingency plans for all those outcomes.
But you haven't done that in this case. You're just saying you think it'd be a good thing for GMP to do.
I agree. I think it would be a good thing for
Okay.
yes.
And you heard Mr. Smith's testimony this morning about, I think he testified both that they didn't view, given the scale of the program, that that kind of sensitivity analysis was necessary here. But even looking at some range of sensitivities, they don't view the issues you've raised as creating a significant concern about whether the program will actually deliver the benefits it's expected to deliver. Is that correct?
So if
Just want to, you heard that testimony this morning.
I did hear it.
Okay.
I didn't agree with all of it.
Okay.
The concern being, right, if the vast, I'll use these words, if the vast majority of some of those benefits occurring from transmission and capacity, and those assumptions are not correct, then what does happen? I have not had the benefit of seeing any analysis that Mr. Smith may have done over the past day or two. That's unfortunate. I certainly would like to see it, but here's the deal. And while this is only 2,000 Powerwall units, is that right? Or I don't think GMP is sitting here telling us today that they're ready to go out and sign up 200,000 retail customers and give them all Powerwall.
But Mr. Dawson, GMP is not proposing that in that case, right? Correct?
Exactly, but that's my point. In other words, if that's not what they're proposing, they're only doing a pilot program, what's going to happen at the end of this pilot program and they say, hey, this all worked out great, here are our results, we need to make this available to all our residential retail customers.
Okay.
In other words, if you just allow the same set of circumstances that get us to approve the pilot program.
So you're concerned, it sounds like you're concerned about the future, about a bigger potential project, not necessarily this project. You understand Mr. Smith's statements with respect to the scale of this project, is that correct?
I understand Mr. Smith,
Okay.
yes.
Great. Do you agree with him that capacity prices are generally locked in already for the first 3 years of the Powerwall program? Yes or no?
Correct, he's referring to the forward auctions that have already cleared. Yes.
Okay, great. With respect to RNS transmission rates, do you agree that those rates, I think you said in Discovery that you agree that there's a propensity for those RNS rates to increase over the next 10 years?
Absolutely. There's a lot of things that could drive and increase the RNS rates. There's also the very fact that what GMP is pursuing is the potential to increase RNS. For example, if they are successful in shaving transmission peaks and lowering the overall network demand, then that by itself on the same revenue requirement will increase. Now the question will become, who else is going to follow GMP's lead and also pursue those programs?
So as I understand your testimony direct, with respect to RNS rates, you suggested that GMP use, instead of the 3.2% it used for assuming RNS rates after year 5 in the model, you suggested using a rate of inflation, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And have you had an opportunity to look at what changing from 3.2% to 2% in the model would actually do?
I have not. I suspect it's probably not a material change in that.
Great, thank you.
Maybe this is a question that is impossible to answer, but given that you did not realize that GMP had included the degradation factor in its picture of the Powerwall benefits, does that new realization change or alter in any way your conclusion? And if so, how?
Great question, and I would say it doesn't alter. I think what I heard witness Josh earlier say was that they have included degradation. This is the way they've gone about it. I think I also heard them say something that it's almost like it's a levelized rate over this period, this time period. My concern is this: batteries physically degrade. The ability to chase a peak may be a lot more certain today than it is tomorrow. And great examples of that. I was just listening to battery storage experts last week, who ironically happened to point out ISO New England's 2016 summer peak demand of 25,000 megawatts. They said, you get a few more folks doing battery storage, that peak just shifted from 1 hour to the next 2 hours. You get a little bit more than that, it's now shifting to different days. The question and point being, okay, is it always just going to take 2.7 hours to shave that peak? Or is it going to take more time?
So it sounds like you're talking about two things, both the degradation factor, which hadn't been in your picture. It wasn't an input in your analysis. But aren't you also talking about peak? Which would happen regardless of whether a degradation factor is
But they're very closely tied, right? My concern is that the idea of physical degradation of the battery just means I have less time to dispatch it at the same rate. And as peaks shift, it could be even more difficult to successfully peak shave and therefore get those same benefits.
So we understand the concern about degradation, and your prior concern or your larger concern was that that had not been factored in. But now you know it has been factored in. Doesn't that change your fear, as it were, about the effect, or whether that's not being accounted for?
Right, I heard what Ms. Johnson, I'm
Yeah.
still not quite sure I understand exactly how they factored in for degradation. And so I almost want to hold my side.
So it was a hard question. Thank you.
I have one follow-up question.
Sure.
Mr. Hand asked you about conducting forecasting within the ISO New England Chemical Energy Test. Does your firm have experience on behalf of any other clients in conducting energy forecasting, price forecasting in any other regions or markets in the United States?
Yes, we do. We actually do a number of transmission capacity and energy forecasts in a number of different regions across the country, PJM, MISO, SPP, ERCOT. We do this on somewhat of a routine basis.
Thank you.
No further questions? Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Pardon me, now, Mr. Kevin Merritt.
Good afternoon, Mr. Barrett. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Just to let you all know, there's some changes to Mr. Merritt's exhibit 10 that we have to walk through that are a result of some conversations we've had with your power today. I could have him walk through those changes right now where we file a revised copy of the exhibit that has the correct numbers instead of trying to look for it.
Mr. Smith and Mr. Hand, are these changes that you may want to ask questions about or not?
I'm just going to have a summary question to confirm the number. We've discussed the changes, the scope of the changes, and they resolve some of our concerns about his testimony.
All right. You seem to be the issue. Okay, I think filing it later will be fine rather than,
And just to provide you all some clarification, this is Mr. Merritt's exhibit 10, which outlines the calculations he used for his market recommendations. There are some calculations in there that use the 12-month period as opposed to the 9-month period that GP has for the rate year. After conversations with GMP, we just identified that. So some of those recommendations will ultimately be small. The rate is and I give a lot. I just have one more question. Mr. Merritt.
okay.
You're aware that on Tuesday, the department through rebuttal or supplemental rebuttal testimony from Mr. Thomas about the revised cost of service.
Yes.
Mr. Thomas.
Through Mr. Thomas, the department filed a revised cost of service model on Tuesday.
Yes.
And the basis of revising that was changing some of the recommendations you made with respect to transmission and distribution projects.
Yes, I do remember.
And do you agree with Mr. Thomas that those changes should have been made?
Yes.
Mr. Merritt is now available for cross-examination.
Okay, Mr. Hand?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Merritt. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Met earlier, but I'm Jeff Hand, representing GMP. I have a few additional questions and appreciate your clarifications in advance of my questions. So just to confirm at a high level, with respect to your blanket recommendations, I originally read your testimony to say you have concerns about whether blankets meet certain regulatory standards here in Vermont. If you understand that blankets have been allowed historically here,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And is it also true that you are familiar with the memorandum of understanding that GMP and the department entered into in the 2018 rate case with respect to blanket spending?
I am familiar with the MOU. The MOU talks about capital. It does not use the word blanket anywhere in the MOU, but I have read that.
Okay. Can you put some cross exhibits in front of you there? Look quickly at exhibit GMP cross KJM9.
I have it.
Is this a copy of the memorandum of understanding you were just referencing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you turn to paragraph 9 first?
Yes.
You agree in paragraph 9 that sets out the purpose of the MOU, and point 2 there says to provide the Commission with appropriate documentation standards for GMP to satisfy the known and measurable requirements for a traditional cost of service case. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And then can you turn to paragraph 27, please?
I have it.
Right there. That paragraph, I think you said you didn't believe the MOU spoke directly to blankets, but it's true, is it not, that that paragraph says, with respect to specific capital projects that are reviewed in conjunction with any future rate adjustment request, GMP agrees that it will create project-specific documentation for any single capital project within a blanket work order that exceeds $250,000, including but not limited to capital projects in the blanket work orders for distribution lines, distribution substations, generation transmission lines, and lists some other blankets.
Yes, it calls to take out large projects
Okay. From the blanket work orders.
from a blanket work order.
And you would agree that that specifically indicates then that smaller projects will remain in the blanket work order?
It doesn't specifically say that to me. It just talks about pulling it out of a blanket work order.
Okay. All right. You weren't involved in negotiating this?
No, sir, I was not.
Okay. I do understand, though, from your testimony that in part because of the MOU, you agreed to remove any objection to spending on blankets or individual projects in the 2018 calendar year period. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So just to be clear, with respect then to the individual T&D projects that are still in dispute, there are 3 remaining projects, is that right?
3 remaining blanket projects.
I'm sorry, 3 individual projects. Is that
Okay,
correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. There are 2 MOAB projects
2 MOAB projects.
and 1 distribution line.
Excuse me.
And those are listed in Mr. Thomas's supplemental testimony.
Yes.
With respect to those individual projects, it's true, is it not, that you didn't have occasion to inspect the facilities that you're raising questions about?
No, sir, I have not been to the site for any of those.
And you have no familiarity with the operation of those facilities?
Well, from experience as a utility engineer, I'm very familiar with gang operating switches and MOABs and the project as described.
But not specific to those locations?
No, not specific to those locations.
Do you agree that MOABs provide a level of increased safety for GMP work crews?
I said in my testimony that it does increase the level of safety, but at the same time, the gang-operated switches, the manually operated switches, which I think Mr. Fisk said that they had maybe 100 or 200 of those remaining in service, can also be operated safely.
But moving to a MOAB, I think you agreed in discovery that that does provide a measure of improved safety.
It does provide a measure of improved safety. But
Okay, thank you. With respect to outages, do you agree that MOABs actually can reduce the duration of outages that are experienced by GMP customers?
potentially in their use, when you have a transmission outage, you can use a switch to change the feed and isolate a section. The current manually operated switches do the exact same thing. Normally with transmission, you want to get out and look at it and make sure you understand where the fault is prior to operating the switch. So a man still has to go out there and physically inspect it, and then you can operate the switch remotely. I'm not familiar with utilities who will just operate those switches without putting an eye on what the problem is.
Okay. Did you hear Mr. Fisk's testimony today that GMP believes its use of SCADA-operated MOABs does decrease the duration of outages?
In my opinion, if it reduces it by minutes and not hours.
Okay. I want to turn to your blanket recommendations now. Mr. Burke said you'll be filing some supplemental information explaining the current blanket recommendations. Generally speaking, you had recommended about $12.1 million in reductions in
Yes.
3 blankets, correct?
That's correct.
And my understanding is that now with the current adjustments you just made, that recommendation is more like 9.1 million. Is that correct?
That is correct.
The adjustments you're making are to 3 blankets, the regulators and capacitors, the transformers, and the distribution line blankets.
That's correct.
Okay. And in reviewing your testimony, it sounds like you've looked at those blankets. You understand in Vermont that blankets have typically been developed based on 5-year historical averages, correct?
That's my understanding, that's how it was in the last rate case.
Okay. And in fact, it's been that way for some time. Did you go back to see how long it's been done that way?
In talking to council, I understand it's been done that way for a while, but my research only went back to the last rate case.
Okay, thank you. Instead of taking that approach, it sounds like you identified some categories of the types of projects you would remove from blanket spending. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And do I understand correctly that the adjustments you're showing here, they reflect, in your judgment, that you need to remove from blankets reliability upgrades? Is that correct?
Yes.
You need to remove, for example, projects that are requested by state agency of transportation or municipalities, those road line relocations.
Yes, that's in my testimony.
Okay. And so you undertook some effort to identify those kinds of projects and then re-establish a blanket number for GMP.
I did it kind of in the opposite way, which was identify those that I felt would make sense to stay in. In this rate case, they're using revenue from customers added in 2019, so there should be cost to hook up those customers. So I did some estimates in transformers, regulators, capacitors, and distribution line to try to capture those new customers. Then I also included replacement of poles and also some replacement of aged equipment in the capacitor regulator section.
Okay. I want to ask you have a table in your rebuttal exhibit testimony. I think it's on page 6. Is your rebuttal testimony.
Yes, sir, I have it.
Okay. So as part of your opinion on blankets, you prepared this table. I think the purpose of the table was to look at whether you felt like it was reasonable to assume GMP would spend money in its blankets in the rate period.
Yes, I had asked a data request to find out how much money had been spent through July 2018.
And the conclusion you came to based on this table as you presented it was that GMP spending, as you showed it here, was behind in terms of its forecasted budget spending, correct?
Well, my conclusion in looking at the table, it was sporadic. Some were over and some were under on the budgets.
Okay. Do you understand now that there's an error in the comparison in this table that you presented?
Because of the, what I'm comparing it to is the 12 months ending in September of 2018.
It is confusing. There are fiscal year periods and calendar year periods and two different rate periods. But my understanding is the left-hand column in your table is, you presented it as GMP's 2018 budget, but that's a fiscal year budget,
That's
correct?
a fiscal year budget, that's correct.
And then the numbers you compare it to in the middle table, the actual spending through July of 18, you actually only asked GMP for data from January of 2018 to July of 2018, correct?
That is correct, it was a calendar year.
Okay. So you're missing months of spending in this table, both spending that's already occurred as well as spending that still will occur in the rate period.
Yes, sir, the table is not complete.
Okay. And if I told you that spending, for example, on the regulators and capacitors that you show here is actually right on target for that period of time, the fiscal or calendar year fiscal year 2018, do you have any reason to doubt that?
To go from 0 to $1 million, I don't know. I just haven't seen any evidence. I'd be glad to look at it if we had it.
But you don't have that information. You didn't ask for that information.
I don't have that information.
Okay.
It's sitting here today.
Great. Thank you. That's all I have.
Stewart?
Yeah, I'll ask one question about the switches. Just basically the same question that I asked to GMP's witnesses. How should the commission be balancing when an investment in a switch is warranted? I mean, I think the record does show that there are some benefits. You might dispute about the magnitude of the reliability benefits or the safety benefits that are accrued because of changing to the MOAB. But how is the commission supposed to make a decision about when that's justified?
So, I think you touched on it this morning a little bit, which is the age of the existing switch. If the switch was at the end of its useful life and you have to buy a new switch, well, for your MOAB, well, you're more than halfway to the cost if you were going to replace it with a manual switch. The other thing that you would typically use these switches for is if you had a area where you did have a lot of interconnection with the transmission that would allow you to backfeed and back up other circuits that had some reliability problems. The concern I had is when we asked them about, well, how many times have we operated, what other problems are there, it was very generic. It wasn't very succinct as to why those particular switches.
So it's not so much a hard, like, hours of reliability per dollar, but it's more when you need to make an upgrade, you should make it, or otherwise there needs to be a specific reason for that switch to be changed.
That's right. Those switches are more for, I would call it resiliency, right? So when power goes out, you can get it back a little bit quicker because you can change feeds. So it's a resiliency piece as well as the capital piece on replacing the switch prior to the end of its useful life.
Follow up on that, you said it's a resiliency fix, so power can come back faster, but earlier I believe you said that it's a matter of minutes, not hours. Could you explain that? So what's the benefit if, as you say, it's only minutes, and yet there is a resiliency fix?
I'm trying to come up with the right scenario. So, with the manually operated switch, as long as you have the ties in place, you can manually open and close the switch and change feeds. If you have a major outage going on, then there is advantages not to have to dispatch a crew to physically operate that switch as things come on and things become fluid. That's why I see those as being advantageous.
In their remote capability.
In their remote capability, yes.
You're going to revise PSD KKM 10 to account for the 12 versus the 9 months. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I know that's simplistic, but that's basically what you're doing. And then, but for page 6 of your server bundle testimony, that chart, you don't have the information to actually do it on the fiscal year all the way across.
No, ma'am, I do not, I do not.
Thank you.
Stop there.
Okay.
Do you still have in front of you the exhibit that Mr. Hendrick, you had to read from, which is marked as KJM 9, it's the cross exhibit at the end of your document?
Yes, I do.
And can you turn to page 6 of that document?
I have page 6,
And can you turn to paragraph 22?
22.
And if you see about 5 lines down, there's a sentence that begins with the word except.
Yes.
Can you read that sentence, please?
Except where expressly stated otherwise in this MOU, this adjustment reflects an agreement between GMP and the department to resolve all disagreements about the department's recommended capital reductions in this case, including the department's proposed blanket reduction, capital reduction, and is made with respect to this case, rate case alone, without establishing precedent in future cases.
Thank you. And that's all that I have.
Further questions? Thank you, Mr. Morris.
So our next witness is going to be Mr. Dick Thomas.
Good afternoon.
Do you swear at or affirm in the penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give should be true, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
And Mr. Thomas, do you have in front of you copies of your testimony and exhibits that were filed in this case?
I do.
And so all of Mr. Thomas's testimony and exhibits have been admitted to the records of the business. Well, actually, let me ask you one question. Do you have to make any revisions to testimony or exhibits?
I do not at this time.
Now, I would like to make Mr. Thomas available for questioning.
I don't have many questions, and maybe it's just a clarifying one, more for counsel than for Mr. Thomas. When Mr. Mara makes his adjustments, we should figure out whether Mr. Thomas needs to revise cost of service, or if we'll just reflect that through cost of service that we file.
We can file that for the commission if you think it would be helpful to see how our overall recommendation changed based on
Yeah,
it.
I think that would be helpful.
We can do that.
That's all I have.
Sweet. Anything else? You enjoyed your walk?
Awesome. Thank you all very much for having me.
So our next witness is Mr. Edward McNamara.
Good afternoon, Mr. McKeon. Do you swear or affirm in the penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Mr. McNamara, do you have copies of your pre-filed and certified testimony?
Yes, I do.
And you did not sponsor any exhibits, is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you need to make any revisions to your testimony?
Do not.
Mr. McNamara is available for questions.
Mr. Smith?
I just have a few. Good afternoon, Ed. I want to ask you about page 3 of your SIR rebuttal, page 2 going to page 3. You described their process that the department and GMP have tentatively agreed to. The paragraph on page 3, let me step back, actually. in broad terms, the tentative agreement is that GMP will provide further description of its procurement process in its upcoming IRP filing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's the first step. And the second contemplated step is that the department and GMP would have additional conversations about other documentation, specific documentation issues, and would reach agreement that would be filed with the PUC. Correct?
That's correct.
And I understand that you proposed here in your rebuttal testimony that that might occur before the end of this proceeding, or it might simply be followed within 6 months of the end of this proceeding. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Does the department have a position as to whether or not it needs to be resolved in this proceeding, or whether filing 6 months later would be appropriate?
The department is good with having the additional 6 months. I've had some very productive conversations with Mr. Smith and some of his Power Supply team as well. And we're on a good track with this. We do not expect that we would actually have things completely sorted out before the end of this proceeding, but within 6 months is a very reasonable time period.
That's all I have.
Well, that was basically my question that I had, Brad, was an update on the progress of those discussions. And I guess maybe I'll let the commission express it, but my impression is the commission is extremely interested in the company's IRP filing that's coming. And so I guess it's not much of a question, but we're anticipating that filing, and I don't know if the commissioners want to add anything. Maybe not, but.
I think that's a good point. And so, you resolving this in the next 6 months, how does it affect other things that are continuing? They're on the train track, they're going down the track, multi-year rate case, IRP, and you're telling us in 6 months.
So what I'm talking about is not actually the department's review process. What I'm talking about is more some of the issues that were raised in Mr. Dawson's testimony, followed up by Mr. Smith's rebuttal testimony as well, which is how do you document appropriately? How do you create sort of reasonable bounds that don't straitjacket procurement processes, but set forward reasonable expectations about how GMP is going to pursue this, how GMP is going to pursue procurement. And that's something that, for the department, we do want to have some transparency, some sort of repeatability, but at the same time leave flexibility as well. And that's why, in my mind, I'd rather take the time and make sure we have the documentation correct. As we're working through multi-year rate plan, a couple other proceedings, we're not just going to say, oh, do whatever you want on procurement processes. We're going to be talking to GMP. We're going to be looking at what GMP is doing. And also, based on conversations with Mr. Smith, we think that we can have at least a high-level discussion or some high-level documentation about appropriate procurement practices within the IRP. And that filing is due relatively soon. And we'll continue the discussions after this hearing as well.
Thank you.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we have our final witness, which is Mr. Brian Lynn.
Do you swear affirm that the penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Lynn, do you have in front of you your direct testimony, your survey testimony, and your exhibits?
Yes.
Is there a need to make any revisions to those, to any of those documents beyond what we discussed with the exhibit you provided earlier?
Yes.
Can you please walk us through those revisions?
So there are some revisions to make to my server rebuttal testimony. Starting on page 1, line 14, consistent with the change in the
revenue requirements model, the number there that says 2.045 million should say 0.8 million. If you proceed to page 2, line 22, the revenue deficiency there that says 21.486 million.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the number?
21.486 million should read 22.731 million. On page 3, line 1, the percent reduced is now 5.25% instead of the 4.96%. So we've already indicated that the table on that page is going to be replaced with my Exhibit 5. On page 4, line 21, the number that says 22.041 million should say 16.554 million. And then we go all the way to page 10. There is a table on that page. In the line item return, taxes, federal, state, and municipal. In the column that says 2018 settlement, there's a number that says 40,181. That should say 54398. Right next to it, in the dollar change column, there is a number that says 1363. It should be 15580. Just two more. Down at the bottom of that column, cost to ultimate consumers, in the dollar change column, the number that says 8637 should be 22854. And then finally, on line 7 of this same page, where it says 30 million increase, that should be 44.2 million increase.
Can I ask you a clarifying question?
Sure.
So wouldn't the number at the bottom of the 2018 settlement also change?
No, there was a self-reference error in the table. They're supposed to match the table from the previous page.
And Mr. Wynn is now available for question.
Mr. Smith?
No questions.
Mr. Haynes? Try that again, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Wynn. How are you?
Good afternoon.
I have a few questions for you. First, just a couple of clarifying ones. You were here for Mr. Mara's testimony just a few moments ago?
Yes.
Okay. And you understand that he's going to be making some further adjustments to his T&D recommendations, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I'm correct, am I not, that the department is adopting those adjustments?
Yes.
Okay. Given the discussion we had with him and we've had over the course of this proceeding about the use of blankets, treatment of blankets in the 2018 MOU, and some of the differences between blankets in 2018 and 2019, do you agree that another way you could approach any concerns the department has remaining about capital spending in that area with just a generic capital adjustment rather than a specific adjustment within the T&D category?
I'd have to see kind of a specific proposal, but I think the department would be willing to discuss alternatives to what is recommended.
Okay. And do you agree that that approach, rather than raising concerns about specific spending in the blanket that's been based on averages, would provide GMP some greater flexibility in how to meet any lower recommendation?
So, yeah, in general, I agree. And GMP needs flexibility on what it spends its blanket project dollars on. We tried the approach in the last rate case of just proposing a dollar limit on capital spending and saying GMP should have the flexibility to decide how to spend under that limit, and we did not feel like that was well received. So this time around, we had our consultants make I would say, a logical recommendation based on, his assessment of the necessity of the specific projects. But again, if there's some alternative that someone would like me to consider, we would consider it.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a copy of your testimony in front of you?
Yes.
Can you turn to your SIR rebuttal testimony?
Got it?
I'm looking at, there's a table on page 15. And this relates to the Powerwall program.
Yes.
So the data in this table, I'm looking in particular at the first part of the table where it goes down to a subtotal ratepayer cost benefit.
Yes.
You developed that data from information that was in Exhibit GMP JC3, is that correct?
Yes.
Since you filed this testimony, we've had some discussion. Do you understand now that GMP JC3 was not updated to reflect the GMP's proposal with respect to Tesla and the rebuttal that it filed?
Yes.
Okay. And it's correct, is it not, that in that rebuttal, GMP proposed delaying some of the in-service dates for the Powerwall program, in part to reduce costs and in part to line up with actual expectations of in-service dates?
Yeah, I'm aware that they delayed some of the in-service dates for the equipment.
And that, with respect to the data you have in this table, that actually ends up adjusting some of these figures, is that correct?
Yes, the figures that are in the rebuttal are cost of service from GMP are different than these figures.
Okay. And I think it's actually, as Mr. Castigay said, JC3 doesn't actually tie directly to the cost of service.
Correct.
Okay. So if you were looking at GMP's updated rebuttal position, have you looked at how this dollar value in the subtotal period or area would change as a result of that rebuttal?
Yeah, I did some analysis on that within the last day or so, yes.
Okay. And am I correct, there's some increased revenue and sales, and then some decreases in power supply savings, depreciation expense, return on rate base, and that results in something around a total of $400,000 instead of the $660 here?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. I want to have you look at page 14 of your rebuttal testimony, and
Excuse me, I just want to be clear, which of the line items now is in the 440? Is it the one that says subtotal?
it's the one that says subtotal. Yes.
Thank you.
And I would say that that number is close. In my number, I remember that being about 403,000.
403,
Yes.
thank you.
So taking a step back, I want to look at your testimony on page 14. You acknowledge on line 11 on page 14 that GMP's net present value analysis shows that non-participating customers will see a positive NPV by year 10. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Say it slightly differently, but yes.
Okay. I'm a little confused by the next sentence. So you then say one of the department's criteria for evaluating commercially available consumer products in rate base is that no such subsidy occur. That factor alone should warrant keeping the Tesla Powerwall program out of rates. So are you saying that no subsidy in any year can occur under the department standards? It sounds like that's what you're saying here.
No, I'm not saying no subsidy can occur in any year. What I'm saying is specific to this case. We're talking about a subsidy lasting for 8 years. Based on the numbers I heard this morning, the NPV positive goes between year 9 and 10. And so that subsidy, if you look at the revised table for the 9 months, and not considering the O&M costs, which I think should be considered, that subsidy is $400,000, like we indicated. If you extrapolate that to a year, that's at least $500,000 a year for the first year. We have concerns about whether or not the certainty around the revenue related to the market benefits asserted from the power supply savings. When you consider that uncertainty, which we haven't seen documentation at the level that's asserted in the model or in the case, when you combine that uncertainty, we feel like it's not acceptable to have a subsidy, at least for this rate year. All of our recommendation is just defer it until we can establish with more certainty that this revenue is going to materialize and that there will end up being a positive benefit.
So when you say defer it until we can prove that?
Yeah, my recommendation is that we not allow it in this equipment and rate base until Green Mountain Power can provide additional information or evidence that these benefits are likely to materialize.
Can there be no cross-subsidy at all?
You know, if, for example, let me say it this way. If this was just the timing of a lease payment, and somebody was going to make lease payments, and over time, 2 or 3 years down the road, the lease payments cross over, those lease payments are relatively certain revenues. In that case, all else being equal, you may allow that subsidy to occur because you're fairly certain that the revenue is going to cross over. Here, the revenue isn't going to, by their own projections, isn't going to really provide that benefit to the non-participating ratepayers until year 9 or 10. That's a long time, we feel like, to take that risk.
Do you factor in any benefit of the fact that it's a pilot and that they're trying to learn things from it about how to shape fees?
So I think the circumstances, again, might be different. We've had a discussion today about scope. I think they can learn what they needed to learn from 100 units and have a lot less exposure to ratepayers. So, our concern is the risk exposure to the non-participating ratepayers.
I'm trying to understand how you're using the words revenue and benefit.
Yes.
Because it sounds like they're using it interchangeably, but revenue is a quantifiable stream of income, and benefit can be ancillary. So how are you using them?
Both of them are positive aspects of the project. So both of them help the MPD become positive per GMP's projections. So one's an avoided cost and one is a revenue.
I realize that's what they are, but how are you using them? For example, in the table on page 15, subtotal ratepayers cost, and you then put in parentheses, I guess if it were in parentheses, it would be a benefit.
Correct.
So are you only counting the revenue stream, or are you also counting the ancillary benefits, for example, from peak shaving?
So we counted the benefits that Green Mountain Power included in their model. So those would be under the power supply savings line. And so the revenues that are more certain are under the monthly revenue and the sales line. And that's another thing to point out, is that the sales revenue, once the program's done, most of that revenue will go away. And then you'll be left with the monthly fees.
Mr. Lee, you use the term risk, and is it the department's position that there should be no economic payment by ratepayers, regardless of what the outcome might be if that payment involves an element of risk?
No, it's not. Again, it's a case-specific kind of thing. There are small projects in Green Mountain Power's Innovative Services portfolio that are a cost to ratepayers, but they are small, and we want to encourage Green Mountain Power to innovate, and we're not taking issue with those.
Right, so
EVgo, for example, are the level 2 chargers.
all right, so let's take this specific then.
Right.
There's a risk. And the risk that you see is that 9 to 10 years out, it may not turn out that it turns positive.
If you know, we still feel like a sensitivity analysis here would have revealed how much risk is being taken, but our analysis done by our consultants and reviewed by the department, we feel like the forecasting around the market benefits, the ancillary services, those kind of things, was consistently optimistic. And we haven't seen any real data yet to kind of confirm whether those forecasts are going to be proved out. And so, because of the scope of this project, the scale, and the subsidy being in the $500,000 range or so, depending on how much of the cost you want to count, we feel like that's just a very large number for the non-participating ratepayers to pay.
And what about the risk if we track it down and GMP does not implement pilot? In other words, they say, gee, we can't afford to go ahead if we have to take all of this on ourselves. Have you evaluated, as the department looked at that risk, the risk that we won't know whether or not this power wall provides the kind of benefits that GMP is predicting will occur?
Well, I guess that prejudges what Green Mountain Power is going to do. They have implemented and installed a significant number of these power walls already. We are only suggesting that it be deferred, and there's other rate cases coming down the road or a multi-year rate plan where we could address whether the situation has changed. We don't see there being a risk to ratepayers of using a lower amount of power walls, for example, in their innovative products analysis.
Well, isn't there the risk that they would be paying higher prices because the peak has not been shaved adequately, or as much as it is been shaved?
Yes, I understand there is that risk that we could lose out on a year's worth of peak shaving. But if it does turn out that the ratepayer, that these benefits pencil out, getting them into rates is a matter of simple filing. So there is a trade-off of potentially a year's worth of savings.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding your testimony. It sounds
Right.
like the focal point of it is the 9 to 10 years.
Yes.
And it doesn't seem like if we waited another year, it still wouldn't be 9 to 10 years. It's still, I mean, if you're right that they're being optimistic about what the value is going to be, it's still 9 to 10 years. Is the department ever going to be comfortable with something that has a 9 to 10 year payback period, where the ratepayers are, quote, at risk that maybe it won't pay back?
So I can say that we're not comfortable now, based on the current profile and the risk that we see. And I can say that additional information has the possibility of making us comfortable.
So
I
tell
can't
me-
guarantee that it will.
So, Mr. Wynn, can you talk about, well, you're saying defer it till they can prove the benefits, and you're saying, there could be other things. What other kind of things? I understand that the company has the burden here, but
Correct.
what kind of things are you talking about that would prove the benefit?
They would have more history on whether or not they've been able to meet the peaks, like they've forecasted. We would have more information on the performance of the power walls and the availability of the power walls and the market prices. we, granted, will not have much better information on forecast prices for 5 years from now. But we, right now, between the fact that we have very little actual documented savings, that this is not like one of the solar battery joint venture projects where it's a utility asset. This is a commercially available consumer product. And when we layer that complication in on this, and the fact that GMP has, even though we are working to try to mitigate competitive advantages with the way we approach these, there's still competitive advantage there. All of that just kind of balances out to me that we need to wait.
Can I follow up on that?
Oh, yes.
Well, I've torn out like 10 pages, so we're almost done.
Sorry.
No, I appreciate that, and they were similar to my questions. So,
Sure.
Mr. Wynn, I actually want to follow up on a couple of those points. So I think the commission asked you, what additional information is going to be available in a year that's going to help us better understand the potential benefits here? And what I heard you saying is, the one you really listed was, is there more information on whether they can hit peaks? And first of all, just to set the stage, so GMP has installed a large number of these units already, correct?
Yes.
And they actually executed their performance strategy this summer with the installed units to hit the FCM peak, correct?
Correct.
And that action, even though the project's not in rate base yet, that will produce benefits, power supply benefits now and in the rate period for customers, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But with respect to whether we're going to hit peaks, what I heard your expert, Mr. Dawson, just say is he actually has no concerns about the considerations in the model that relate to our performance against the peaks in the early years, the forecast of peaks and the communication availability of the resource. He says he's got no concerns about those things. What he's concerned about is this question of degradation, correct?
He's concerned about degradation, but I also, in his testimony, he makes a lot of points about each of the different aspects of the market price forecasting that went to this net present value analysis, all of those having some optimism in them as well.
I understand that, but I think in the question from the commission, what you just said is we're not going to have a lot more certainty on that for several years. And in fact,
may or may not, yes. I cannot project.
And it seemed like your experts expressed optimism, I think, about the factors in the model that address your concern about hitting peaks in the early years. The question of what the prices are going to be, what the forecasts look like, it seemed like they also conceded that with respect to FCM, that's set for the next 3 years. So next year when we come back here, we're sitting in this room again talking about whether the power walls may or may not go into rates. The same information essentially is going to be available on the early year benefits of these projects. And they also testified, I think you agree, that R&S rates are not going down. They have a propensity to go up. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that. But I think the risk we're talking about, so right now, the program as proposed is that GMP is asking the non-participating ratepayers to take that risk for 2,000 power walls. Whereas if Green Mountain Power was concerned about the fact that it may not be practical to demonstrate their benefit of these projects for several years, it seems like a logical decision for them to make was to limit their exposure and maybe do fewer power walls.
But I appreciate that perspective, but I think what the GMP is saying is that their analysis, what they view as a fairly conservative analysis, levelizing, for example, the expectation of when they're going to be able to hit peaks, despite the fact that they're hitting 100% this year, they're using a number of 72% in the model. Mm-hmm. It sounds like you would agree GMP's position is we feel very good about this model. We believe it is going to provide benefits, and therefore we think it should be in rates so those benefits flow to customers now, correct?
I agree that that's GMP's position. Yeah.
And those benefits that they're concerned about are benefits that are actually accruing. this is not a known and measurable question. It's not, are we going to spend the money and is the benefit going to flow? It's more a question of whether, how you look at those particular benefits and when they arrive for customers. And you agree the company has taken the position that it would like to pass those benefits on to customers as soon as possible.
So it is, again, a pilot program where the company is asking, based on a forecast, where prior to implementing the program, they didn't do a sensitivity on those forecasts to highlight those risks. They're asking now the ratepayers to take that risk. And I'm only trying to balance the equities here and say, I don't think it's fair to ask the ratepayers to take the risk of a pilot program of this scope based on this level of uncertainty. I mean, we have, there's a lot of things here that have to work out for this to be a positive present value for the ratepayers.
And no further questions.
I have one more, Mr. Wynn. Let's assume that we say no. GMP says we're not going to go to 2,000, we're going to use the ones we've got now. 3 years go by, they hit the peaks of all 3 years, and they come back and they say, now we want the 2,000. What is the possibility that your department will say, you don't have enough data, you should have had 2,000 Powerwalls?
I don't think the department is going to say we should have had 2,000 Powerwalls. If I'm here, they're not going to say that.
Now we're talking about another risk.
I mean, the innovative programs, the way they're designed, they're really meant for the company for the first 18 months to use the time to really understand the risk of the program and that kind of thing. This is a difficult dilemma that really wasn't anticipated by the way the program was designed when you're asking to take a rather significant financial bet or risk for a significant period of time. And so I'm not saying there's an easy answer to any of this.
Isn't it possible that one might have said, had only 100 Powerwalls been deployed and put into the request to go to Great Base, that the answer or criticism would have been 100 isn't enough to provide any benefit because it doesn't do much to GMP?
Well, it's not something I would advocate. It's just.
But it sounds like you were saying, had it been only 100, for example, it would have been different. 2,000 is on such a large scale.
When I was talking about the 100, I was trying to address the question from GMP's attorney that said, what's the right amount of time to wait for these things? And if they were concerned about that exposure being a long period of time, it seems to me it argues for a smaller number of Powerwalls to be implemented.
I only have one question, and then we may be done.
Yeah, he's our final witness.
So-
Sent to
Okay, well, I don't think we'll have much. But if you want to take my question is that the department expressed somewhat similar concerns about an asymmetry of risk when it was reviewing the JV solar and storage projects. And in that case, the department and GMP have proposed for commission approval, it hasn't been approved yet, but basically a risk sharing mechanism where there will be a periodic look back and true up at the actual performance of the project. Did the department consider or discuss with GMP using a similar mechanism for this project?
We have not considered or discussed that. I would point out that the JV microgrids are a utility asset, not behind the meter commercially available project. And we did work out an agreement to share the risk. That's something I could look at, and but it seems to me the fact that these are consumer products and we're getting into the competitive advantage concerns area, that we'd have to make a more careful consideration on how that would work and whether we would be offering that, whether that would be some sort of a benefit that may not be available to non-regulated competitors in GMP.
On the question of commercially available products in competitive markets, is there a policy reason to allow those types of products into rate base?
The department has taken what I think is actually a fairly progressive approach when you look at utilities across the nation regarding this issue. We have tried to encourage innovation, and we have looked for a way of establishing boundaries around these commercially available consumer products that try to mitigate the competitive advantages that regulated monopolies may have in this area. We can't completely eliminate them, but I think based on the criteria that we use to evaluate, which include, making sure that these kind of extended subsidies don't occur, that other criteria is that the Green Mountain Power make available their billing system to competitors in this area, and that the non-participating ratepayers do not bear the bad debt expense associated with any of these projects. Those are all steps we're taking to try to balance those risks. So we feel like it's a rather progressive approach, but we have to take it case by case and balance it.
How is GMP supposed to know what the right size of an innovative cloud project is?
I think that's, again, there's multiple factors to consider. If it's a $10 million project but there's no subsidies, in year one, that's different than a $15 million project with potentially 8 years worth of subsidies. So I can't give you a solid rule on that. I wish I could.
Just one more follow-up based on the commission questions. Mr. Wynn, we just had a discussion about considering this Powerwall program in the context of commercially available alternatives. Do you agree that someone right now could go out and buy a battery, put it in their home, replace their generator, not connect it to the grid, and install that without any interaction of the utility controls?
Yes.
That's not what these power walls are, correct? In that instance, the homeowner would have complete control over when they discharge, how they use it. The power walls are a grid asset, as Mr. Castigay described. They function as a distributed network to meet a specific need for utility customers, correct?
That's the way you described it, yes.
Do you agree that that is different than just a simple in-home battery installation? The coordinated management of this type of network differentiates it from a standard consumer product.
That's, I think, one of the requirements of our program. We had that same requirement for each of these programs that for GMP to get them in a rate base, they have to be controllable, positively controllable for the benefit of all ratepayers. That's because of that not being positively controllable is why we're recommending for heat pump water heaters, for example, to not be included in rate base. So that's a fundamental kind of requirement from the from the public service department's point of view to consider having a consumer product in rate base. And I would note that, but the GMP also has a program where people can sign up for the benefit of all of the ratepayers. and they've just launched it, have a couple of participants on it.
Okay, that's all I have.
I just have a couple quick questions. We had some questions that started Commissioner Hoffman about the timing. About the timing of rate basing of the Powerwall program. And is it your understanding that Mr. McNamara, in his testimony, recommended that GMP be allowed to rate base the Powerwall costs after it receives authorization from the Commission to offer this program as a permanently tariff service?
Correct.
And you had some questions from Chairman Reisman regarding risk. And is it the department's position that on the innovative projects that GMP should shoulder the bulk of the risk for the innovative projects?
Yes. I want you to repeat the question, though.
Should GMP be carrying all of the risk for the innovative project? Maybe I should ask that differently.
I think there is a proportion. When you say bulk versus all, those are two different numbers. There's a proportional risk sharing that could be available in some of these projects. But the way I understand that the program was created is that there is no guarantee that these products will be in rate base.
I think that's all that I have.
Thank you.
Does it make sense to take a break now and come back and do the wrap-up, or should we just plow ahead?
Get it done.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're close to done. I'd say we wrap.
Here's brief.
We have a break.
Are there any other matters that we need to discuss today then?
You're still okay with the briefing schedule?
Yeah, the group briefing schedule's fine. We have a clean version of the exhibit list with all the additional exhibits we discussed today. Unfortunately, I left it out of the room, but we could file that on EPUC if that's helpful.
Yes, and I would like to commend the parties. You've done a good job of helping us track the changes in your positions and recommendations and the cost of services it's going through. But and I encourage you to keep up that good work. I haven't seen that there looked like a lot of trades got made in this last day. So as long as your final briefs and proposals thank you for the fact can clearly show us where things have evolved to, at that point we would really appreciate it.
And we will get the revised exhibits and cost of service modeling to you in advance of filing our briefs, would be our expectation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And the witnesses particularly, who were all very helpful, and we appreciate it. Mr. Smith, thank you for being here. We're adjourned.